today's episode of Lawn Dev Dad, we're going to talk about fertilizer. If you've ever looked on a bag of fertilizer, you've probably noticed the numbers on there. Those correspond to nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You can think of that as up, down, and all around health for the plant. If you think your lawn like a puzzle, there are lots of different pieces that it needs. It needs common elements, it needs micronutrients, and then it needs macronutrients. And the N, P, and K we're talking about here are the macronutrients. So I decided to film in the garage mainly today because we got a lot of rain throughout the day, and I don't really want to sit out in the wet lawn to do the video. So this is kind of my war room here. I got all my different fertilizers and got some more over here. Got my spreader there. Then I have my tank sprayer right there. Got a bunch of different weed killers and things up there with another sprayer. So yeah, lots of stuff. So we're going to talk about fertilizer today. As I talked about in the intro a little bit, on the bags of fertilizer, you'll usually see three numbers. Here's a couple different ones that I have. You have either granular in the bags, or you have liquid in the jugs, and they have the numbers on them too. And that is basically just your NPK percentage in that specific fertilizer. So this specific one is 24% N, no P, and then 6K. And then 7020, 223. So you might be wondering, what are all these numbers actually talking about, and why are they all so different? So I've used lots of different types of fertilizers over the years. When I started out, I was pretty much like everyone when they start out, most likely, and used the Scott's or whatever I found at my local store brand. And I would get the one in the spring, which was usually the crabgrass preventer. The one for the summer, I think, had some kind of a insect control maybe. And then they came out with a winterizer also that had certain things that, you know, helped winterize the lawn. So there are a lot of different types of fertilizer that do specific things. Some of them have high nitrogen, which pushes a lot of growth. Some of them have lower nitrogen amounts that will basically not push a lot of top growth. Remember, up, down, all around. So the first number, nitrogen, causes the blades to grow. And then the 20 there at the end actually is the overall health of the grass. So that is a stress blend for summertime, when you don't really want it to grow a whole lot, but you want it to stay healthy and defend against disease and heat stress and all those types of things. So these are a couple different examples of the specific. And then this one here actually has quite a bit of iron in it, which is one of those micronutrients that I talked about briefly. So why are there so many different types of fertilizer? I mean, aside from just the obvious with the granular versus the liquid, you have stress blends and winterizers and all these different starter fertilizers and organic, fast release, slow release. There's just kind of a maddening array of options available. So you kind of have to understand what you want to do for your specific yard, and depending on the type of grass you have, the time of year, all that kind of stuff will determine which fertilizer makes the most sense. And some of them have a lot of extra things like iron and micronutrients and stuff like that to kind of help you get a more balanced product so that you don't have to apply fertilizer and other things, so you can really just focus on just a few applications. So we have the general idea of the NPK being the up, down, all around for the growth of the blades, the roots, and the all-around plant health. But looking a little bit deeper into those, so you want fertilizers higher in nitrogen, the first number, the N, when you want things to be growing. So for cool season lawns, which is what I've always had, you basically want to do that in the spring, especially so that it kind of wakes up and starts growth. And then also again in the fall when it cools down. So you don't want to be doing a lot of N during the summer, because then it's just going to be stressing it out even more trying to grow and keep up. And then with the P, the middle number, that's mainly for when you plant new seeds or you want growth. So sometimes you'll do that in the spring to kind of help things perk up again, or even in the fall to kind of help establish the roots like late fall, so that over the winter the roots will continue kind of growing. And then the last one with potassium, that's especially really good in the summer when you don't want to have a lot of growth, but you want to protect your grass from stress. You basically want to have high potassium, high K, the last number. And that's also good again in the fall, because you're kind of going into this dormant time where, you know, you might have snow or whatever else on it for months. So you want to kind of get it resilient for that time. So how much fertilizer do you actually have to apply? That really depends on a lot of things. Most of them have directions that will tell you, like this one is 3 pounds per 1,000. Then the liquids have a similar thing where you mix it with a gallon of water and you spray that per 1,000. But the first key step is to actually know how many square feet you're going to be covering. So I have 8,500 square feet. There's a lot of different tools and ways that you can figure that out. You can get one of those measuring wheels and walk it out and do it yourself. You can go to Google Maps and drop a pin, and then there's a measuring tool, so you can kind of get an estimate of your different areas and work out the dimensions that way. You can get an app, like Yard Mastery app has a measuring tool inside of it. If you go to that in the App Store and download it, you can actually do the whole perimeter of your lawn, and it'll tell you exactly how many square feet it is. So there's a lot of different options, but once you know how many square feet, like for me, I have about 8,500. So this bag almost covers 2 full applications if I were to do it at the full rate. And generally when you do the full rate, the recommendation for most fertilizers is about 45 days between applications. Now, some people prefer to do more frequent, what is often referred to as spoon feeding applications. And I often prefer to do that so that I will actually put less, maybe more like 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet, but I'll do it more often. So instead of like every 40 days, I might do that every 20 or 25 days. So it's kind of a more balanced, steady feed that way. So most of these fertilizers that I use are slow release, or at least partly slow release, so they don't necessarily have it all used up within, you know, a short amount of time anyway, but still doing it every month roughly still kind of helps it stay even and consistent, and then I don't get a lot of spurts and lulls in my growing, so it kind of keeps it nice and steady, which is a lot easier to kind of determine how often to mow and when to do other things. One of the biggest things that I get asked when I tell people that I fertilize, you know, once a month or every 20, 25 days is, isn't that too much nitrogen? And the answer is no. If you keep track of it and only put down a certain amount a season, like the rule of thumb that I've always heard is about 5 pounds per season, at least for cool season lawns, Kentucky bluegrass, fescue, rye. I've heard about 5 pounds of nitrogen per year is an acceptable amount, and I space it out over that entire year. But I don't do it consistently. Like I said, in the summer, I want to pull back and not put as much. So in that 5 pounds, I generally try to do about 2.5 pounds in the spring, you know, really ramp things up, get it growing, get everything really healthy, and then pull it way back to only about 1 pound through the summer. So end of June, July into August, I've only put about 1 pound of nitrogen on it, and then go back up a little bit to 1.5 for kind of the fall into early winter season, so that, you know, everything will really reestablish and be completely healthy to go into that dormant period throughout December into March, basically. So as long as you keep it around that 5 pound mark, you won't have any issues with over fertilizing. Now, if you put down a full bag every 20 days, then yes, you would probably have some issues with just way too much nitrogen, too much growth. And if it grows that quickly and that aggressively, that can really hurt your grass because it just doesn't have the time to properly take everything in that it needs and grow naturally. So another thing that I do to kind of keep fertilizing throughout the year, in addition to my fertilizer applications, is I mulch pretty much exclusively. I don't bag unless I'm doing like a dethatching where I want to get rid of a bunch of the old dead stuff or something like that. Then I'll occasionally bag, but I pretty much always make sure that I don't let my grass get too high to be able to mulch if I can help it. And then by mulching it and going over it, you know, slowly with hopefully not being too wet or anything like that so it doesn't clump, all of those clippings will just end up going back down into the soil, and you regain all of that nitrogen that was in the clippings back into the whole chain of things. So I've heard you get maybe about 2 pounds of nitrogen a year through doing your clippings with mulching. And I mean, that's just free fertilizer, basically. You're throwing it away otherwise, so I always do that. Another thing that I never used to do that is really helpful that I've been doing recently is soil tests. Generally about once a year in the fall. And you do want to wait about 45 days is what I've heard after your last fertilizing to do the soil tests. And basically you just go around the yard and take plugs of your soil and then mix it all together, and you send it in and see what your soil is composed of. So that really helps you know if your fertilizer amounts are working out, micronutrients especially. Like I had, you know, low iron and high calcium and all these other things. pH is another thing that I learned. I had high pH, so I've started using some things to try to get that down within the acceptable range. But if you do your soil test, then you can kind of see where things are at and adjust what types of fertilizer and your, you know, NPK percentages in that fertilizer to try to get the proper balance. So on the topic of granular versus liquid, I had used granular for 15 years plus before ever trying liquid. It's just kind of the go-to. You can get it at any store. You can usually find a spreader. A lot of them will have the settings for the major spreaders right on the bag. So it's pretty foolproof if you follow the directions. The liquid is a little bit more difficult, mainly because I wasn't used to it, but you kind of have to make sure you have either a consistent pressure, and when you use the pump style sprayers, it's hard to get that, so I ended up getting a backpack sprayer that has a battery, so I can set it to, you know, 30 or 40 psi or whatever it is. That way you get a consistent pressure, which your flow rate is adjusted based on your pressure. So you have to kind of learn how to do all that and get the right tips so that it covers it properly, and kind of know your pace when you're walking so that you're getting the right amount. Generally, it ends up being about 1 gallon per 1,000. So if you put in 4 gallons of water, like my sprayer holds, and then you put in the appropriate amount of the liquids, and I generally mix a couple different things when I do it, just because, you know, it's a lot of work, because then you got to clean the tank and everything afterwards too. So I'll do like a fertilizer and maybe some kind of micronutrient blend or something with it, just to get, you know, more bang for my buck for doing all of it. And you go through your lawn with the sprayer, and I have to do 2 4-gallon tanks full to get my full coverage, and generally it works pretty well. So my recommendation would be, if you're just starting out and you don't want to complicate things too much, stick with the granular. It's just easier to deal with if you don't really want to do a lot of mixing and measuring and figuring all that stuff out. But if you then, you know, want to try to do some different things, you can get all kinds of different liquids and do those. I've heard the liquids are more efficient because they don't have to be broken down as much. They're more consistent because, you know, it's a liquid, so everything's mixed really well, compared to the granules, which might be different parts. Quick note, you might notice on most of these bags in the upper left corner that they contain iron. And also Milorganite is kind of one of the original iron fertilizers. Iron is really good for getting a dark green look in your grass. So even if you're giving it plenty of everything else and it's deficient in iron, it just isn't going to look as impressive. So either doing some kind of a liquid iron or even a granular iron by itself, or getting fertilizer with iron, is definitely something that I recommend because it makes a big difference in the visual of your grass. One thing I notice people seem to struggle with a lot is calculating how many pounds of nitrogen they actually get when they're putting something down. So like with a lot of the ones that I was showing you earlier, they say to do 3 pounds per 1,000, and then you look at the nitrogen numbers. So the first bag I was doing is 24, so you would actually multiply that by 0.24 to figure out how many pounds of nitrogen you get per 3 pounds of the overall product. So as you can see, it's 0.72 pounds per 1,000. So like in the spring, if you're trying to get that 2.5 pounds like I talk about, you would actually still have quite a bit left to go in the spring. So that about wraps it up for fertilizer. If you have any questions, put something in the comments and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.